Thousands of refugees are crossing Canada's borders every weekend. The pace could pick up after the president laid out a more concrete plan today to deport millions of undocumented immigrants or migrants. For the hundreds who've already made the trek into Canada, what is their legal fate? And how does that safe third country agreement complicate how the Canadian government should respond? Joining me now is Audrey Macklin, law professor and director of the Centre for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Toronto. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
So we have seen in recent months, and maybe more in particular since the suspended executive order by Donald Trump, this huge increase in the number of people trying to cross the border in Manitoba, in Quebec. Why do you think they're doing that rather than going through the normal channels that you would use to claim asylum?
Well, first, I wouldn't call it a huge increase. We're still talking about tiny numbers in absolute and relative terms. If they were to go through regular channels of claiming asylum in Canada, they would go to a Canadian border with the United States. They'd say, I'd like to make a refugee claim, and it would promptly be deflected back to the United States because of the Canada-U.S. Safe Third Country Agreement. Presumably, there are people who don't feel like the United States is a safe place to claim refugee protection anymore, and so they are circumventing the border post and finding alternative ways across the border. Once in Canada, they can go to an immigration office and claim asylum inland.
So just explain to people, first of all, you don't find the numbers surprising. They are increases from a year ago. They're increases by the hundreds. I understand this is not a refugee crisis the same way we've seen in and around Syria. But for Canada, that's a lot of claimants coming in that way, is it not?
Well, to just put it in perspective,
yes.
If we had proportionally the same number of asylum seekers as Germany had in 2015, we'd have 450,000. So a few hundred is not very many. Secondly, prior to the Canada-U.S. Safe Third Country Agreement, about 14,000, I think, asylum seekers used to come to Canada via the Canada-U.S. border. So again, we're talking about scores, maybe a few hundred, and even that, I think, is still, in relative and absolute terms, very small. Recall that Canada is geographically isolated, so we receive very few asylum seekers compared to other countries simply because of where we're located in the world.
So explain to people, because we've all seen these pictures now circulating, you know, of the RCMP welcoming these people. Explain to people what's actually happening, not only in that moment, but what then has to happen subsequently to people who are essentially illegally entering the country.
When somebody enters Canada and makes a refugee claim, they are entitled to have that claim adjudicated. That means determined by an independent tribunal who will consider whether they meet the definition of a refugee. If that person meets the definition of a refugee, they're entitled under Canadian law to remain in Canada, to not be sent back to a country where they have a well-founded fear of persecution. This is because Canada is a signatory to the UN Refugee Convention. Another important feature of that is that if somebody meets the definition of a refugee, the fact that they may have entered irregularly, illegally, doesn't count against them. This is in the Refugee Convention, it's in Canadian law. Why is it there? It's because we all recognize that people who are refugees will often have to take extraordinary measures to reach a country of safety, precisely because most countries do everything they can to prevent asylum seekers from reaching their borders. And so the idea that refugees have had to travel through irregular means doesn't count against them if, in fact, they meet the definition of a refugee.
Okay, and we've talked on this show before about the Safe Third Country Agreement, and I know lots of people believe that it should no longer be in place. What is your view on that? And do you think that it has ever done what it was supposed to do when it was initially put in place?
Well, it depends on what you think it was supposed to do.
Yeah.
It seems that its main purpose was to simply reduce the number of asylum seekers reaching Canada. As I said, many countries, most countries, do what they can to stop asylum seekers from reaching a border where they can claim the rights that Canadian law and international law provide them with. So the Safe Third Country was really designed to prevent asylum seekers from reaching Canada and, by the by, then increase the number of asylum seekers in the United States. So right now, the premise of the U.S.-Canada Safe Third Country Agreement was that the United States was a safe place to claim refugee protection and that people who reached the United States first should simply seek protection there. I think what a lot of people are saying is that it is no longer, if it ever was, a safe country for people to seek refugee protection. So what happens now, of course, is that people who are desperate for refugee protection can't go to the Canadian border the way they could before the agreement existed in an orderly way, identify themselves to a border official and say, I'm here, I would like to claim refugee protection. Instead, they are compelled, if they want to reach Canada for refugee protection, to seek other irregular means, and that's why you see them crossing at unmarked border posts.
And what do you think the government should be doing? I mean, should they be concerned? I mean, you don't seem to think that the numbers are overboard, but should the federal government be doing something else to either better patrol the border, to better address these people coming in this way? What would be the best course of action in terms of policy?
Well, I think it's not just me who doesn't think the numbers are significant. By any measure, I think the numbers are not significant. I think what the government could do right now is simply suspend the operation of the Safe Third Country Agreement. It doesn't have to permanently cancel it, but it would enable people who are seeking refugee protection to proceed in an orderly way, present themselves at the Canadian border, and be identified by Canadian officials. Now, which is good for Canada, right? It's better for Canada if we know who's entering. But the other thing is that, and in fairness, if more refugees are going to be entering Canada, more refugee claimants, then it's important that all of our administrative structure be ready for that. And so the Immigration and Refugee Board, who is the body tasked with determining whether asylum seekers meet the refugee definition, also has to be adequately resourced so that it can deal with any increase in numbers. I don't think that's beyond the realm of possibility, and I don't think it's unduly onerous, but it's important that it happen.
Let me end on this. I spoke to a mayor in the United States a couple of weeks back who was a mayor of one of these sanctuary cities. Now Montreal has recently taken on this label. Is this useful in any way? Is this symbolic? What is the importance of a sanctuary city, particularly in Canada?
Well, it's really important for people who are irregular or who have no migration status. It doesn't necessarily apply primarily to people who are seeking refugee protection, because once they present themselves to immigration officials, they aren't irregular, they're known, and they can be dealt with in ordinary ways. But for those who have no migration status in Canada, it's important because sanctuary city means that municipal officials, police, fire, health, education, will not be recruited to act as immigration enforcers. And that's some of the fear or the concern that drives the declaration of sanctuary cities. So that if somebody is a victim of crime, she doesn't have to worry that if she reports it to the police, her immigration status will be investigated and she faces the risk of deportation. It means if somebody has a fire, they aren't afraid to call the fire department for fear that somebody's going to ask their immigration status. If somebody is having a heart attack, they don't have to fear that going to a hospital is going to result in their deportation. So for all of those reasons and many more, it seems important to ensure that those sorts of services can be provided to people free of a fear that it will lead to them being turned over to immigration authorities. It's not just in the interests of those people, it's in the interests of municipalities that offer those services, that people who are victims of crime can seek protection, that people who are, in an emergency situation can call on assistance, that children who need to go to school can go to school.
Okay, Professor, learned a lot. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.